Star Wars Battlefront 3 began development in 2006 and was cancelled in 2008. It was never announced or even acknowledged by LucasArts. So, how am I showing you gameplay footage of it? Welcome to the world of video game archaeology. This is Guns for Hire, also known as Xbox 360 Dev Nerd on YouTube. Guns for Hire has been hanging out on my Discord for about a year now, sharing his hobby, which is collecting Xbox 360 dev kits and scanning them for deleted builds of games. And he is part of a much larger community dedicated to collecting and preserving early builds of games across all systems. Guns originally got into hardware modding when his brother traded a PSP for a modded Xbox. They used it to run emulators and pirated games. Years passed and they got a 360 and used it in legal ways instead. But one day in 2012, Guns tried modding it by soldering a chip onto the motherboard and failed horribly. It wasn't until 2017 that he would try again, and this time was successful. While messing with it, he started feeling nostalgic for the original Xbox 360 dashboard, the Blades dashboard, and wanted to try modding it back in. However, you can't downgrade to older firmwares on an Xbox 360 because each update installed burns a fuse in the Xbox, which then prevents it from booting if an older firmware is installed. But Xbox 360 dev kits do not burn fuses, meaning depending on the dev kit model, you can switch to any firmware in the 360's life. Now, if you're not familiar with dev kits, basically it used to be that if a game developer wanted to make a console game, they would have to buy a specialized version of that console called a dev kit, which would allow debugging and modding and things like that. And once they finished making their game, they could transfer it to the actual console, which did not allow debugging. But nowadays with the Xbox One and Xbox Series consoles, you can just pay a $20 fee and get an app that lets you switch between retail and dev mode on your console. Anyways, after Guns heard about dev kits, he went on eBay and bought an Xbox 360 one so he could mess with the original Blades dashboard again. And in the process of learning about all this, he got exposed to the Xbox modding scene, which in turn led to him getting involved in the game preservation scene. Guns for Hire currently owns 12 Xbox 360 dev kits of various models, one PS3 test kit, which is like a dev kit but with limited debugging features, and two original Xbox debug kits, which are also more limited versions of dev kits. Here's his process when he gets a new dev kit. Do not run any code on it or try playing any builds on it. Remove the HDD from the dev kit and connect it to your computer. Make sure your PC does not auto-format it. Use a program like HDD raw copy to make an image of the hard drive, which will be about 120 gigs in size. Now finally, you can use a tool called FATX Tools made by Aerosol to look inside the disk image. Look at the contents, recover folders from it, and most importantly, look at the deleted partition and recover any salvageable data from there. Also, Guns really wanted to stress this: when you get a new dev kit, before doing anything else, make an image of the HDD, because you could potentially be sitting on a canceled game that no one has ever heard of before, and if you start running your own code on it or messing around with it in some way, you could make that game unrecoverable. The most interesting thing Guns has found extracting data from dev kits was an early build of Scarface: The World Is Yours for the original Xbox. It still has debugging features in it, and you can play through early versions of levels. Other people have found unreleased or cancelled games on dev kits. Some examples are the cancelled Blur 2, someone found a build of it showing off new maps and features, Project Milo, a cancelled Kinect game from Lionhead Studios, and the unreleased PSP build of Oblivion. There have also been found around 60 builds of Crysis 3 that are from the start of the game's development all the way to its release. Now, is all of this legal? It's kind of a gray area. According to Guns, these builds are still Microsoft or Sony's property in a sense, but because of liquidations and buyouts, the ownership is lost or something. But the preservation community is definitely not in the clear, because some companies do not like outside users having access to this data, no matter how old it is. For example, Activision has had YouTube channels completely terminated for showing footage of early builds of Call of Duty games that are over a decade old. Also, Rockstar allegedly hired a private investigator to go to someone's house and confiscate their dev kit collection because they had a beta build of GTA 5 that had an audio file on it that was cut from the final game. Guns wasn't really sure why these companies were this antagonistic. He thought maybe companies think that having alpha footage of their games up could hurt their brand image or lead to online service hacks, but the preservation communities he's part of have a rule that they don't touch new or current gen dev kits in games or older games that still have active servers, as this would open the door for hacks and exploits with those, which these communities are not interested in. They're purely doing this for preservation and don't want to get on dev dev's bad sides. Some companies are favorable to the preservation cause though, and work with professional preservationists like those at the Museum of Play, which I'll get to in a bit. So why is there a preservation community? Why do people spend all this time and money and risk potential legal action to preserve early builds of games? Well, according to one preservationist, it's important to preserve games while we still can so that they're not lost to future generations and researchers. Tons of silent films from the early days of movies were lost because no one took the initiative to save them. It's important to save everything while we still can. But this is all the amateur side of things. Let's take a look at the professional. I had the chance to speak to Andrew Borman, who works at the Strong National Museum of Play as a digital games curator. Andrew's interest in game preservation can be traced back to Resident Evil 2. Early in its development, he had seen a screenshot in one magazine that showed zombie arms coming out of jail cells. However, this area was not in the final game, and it made him realize just how much games can change during development. Later, when the Dreamcast was removed from shelves, resulting in tons of games were being cancelled that he had been really interested in, Andrew started doing a lot of research online to learn as much as possible about those games and found himself in a whole new world of gaming. He started reaching out to developers, talking to collectors, and combing lesser-known websites for press resources. In 2005, he started Past to Present Online, or P2P Online, an online magazine which eventually turned into a YouTube channel that focused on discussing game development items and showcasing forgotten and cancelled games. He went to college to study information science, receiving a master's degree focused on research and school librarianship since game preservation wasn't an option. And then after college, he taught research and information skills in school libraries to students from kindergarten through 12th grade. A few years later, a job opened at the Strong Museum, and he's been working there since. Currently, Andrew is mainly working on setting up new exhibits at the museum, since there's a big expansion being added right now, most of which will be video game focused. Besides that, he helps with curation, so finding new things for the museum collection, which he does by searching online on sites like eBay or reaching out to developers, though recently more developers have actually been reaching out to the museum first. He also helps with backing up and digitizing games and supporting the library and archive staff by making one-of-a-kind items like prototype consoles more accessible. He does this by using tools like Mister, which is an open source project that makes it easy to emulate consoles, computers, and arcade boards. One example of Mister usage, it was used to emulate the PDP-1 minicomputer from 1959 that Space War, the first computer game ever, was programmed on. I asked Andrew why he thinks some companies do or don't like working with preservationists, and he said that they've actually had a lot of great experiences working with large companies such as Microsoft, who sent them lots of prototype hardware and other development artifacts, and Activision and Toys for Bob, who worked with the museum to preserve the history of Skylanders by sending them digital files, physical prototype figures, and even manufacturing molds, along with helping the museum conduct interviews with the developers. The biggest challenge for game studios is time. The developers are focused on putting the game out there and don't want to put resources and time into preservation when it could all be going towards development. But lately, studios such as EA have started hiring archivists and other staff to help with preservation. But you won't really see companies putting everything they have on the internet, mainly because it's difficult to do that legally. If you want to open source something, you need to have the licenses to all of the code, which often contains middleware and other packages that the developers don't have the rights to redistribute. For example, the Star Wars Jedi Outcast source code was released online by developers Raven Software, but a few days later they had to take it down because it contained licensed code such as the Bank video codec. And this is why having a museum dedicated to preservation is great, because museums are able to showcase items that they don't have the intellectual property rights to. Just like video games, video game preservation is a new thing, and I think we're fortunate to have so many people who are so passionate about preserving everything possible related to it, and that 200 years from now, people will be able to look back on these first decades of game development and have such a wealth of information to study. If you're interested in checking out some old game builds or hanging out with the people preserving them, I'll link some forums for that in the description. Big thanks to Guns for Hire for providing all this info. I'll link his channel below. He has a ton of footage of early builds of Xbox 360 games on his channel and is working on some history videos about Xbox development, so be sure to subscribe to him to see those. Also, big thanks to Andrew Borman for speaking to me. Be sure to check out his channel P2P Online to see lots of obscure canceled games and game dev items. I'll link that below, along with a copy of our conversation, which has a lot of details that I didn't include in the video. And if you'd like to support me, check out my games on Steam. I'll put a link to that in the description.